I'm very excited to introduce Steve Kornacki. Steve is a national correspondent for a little organization I call NBC News and MSNBC. His work has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Roll Call, and the New York Times. His incredibly timely book, The Red and the Blue, the 1990s and the Birth of Political Tribalism, is also his first. His lively political history of the 1990s is both an absorbing chronicle of the parallel rises of Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich and a look at some of the key elements, debates, and figures that laid the ground for today's political landscape. In many cases, Trump, Schumer, Hillary Clinton, the cast of characters overlap both eras. And he shows us, among other things, how Ross Perot's 1992 presidential bid gave Trump his first taste of electoral politics, and how Hillary Clinton's role in the 1998 midterm elections put her on a track to run for the Senate 2 years later. His book is already garnering praise, with John Meacham calling it an illuminating argument from a master political journalist and analyst. Tonight he's going to be in conversation with Hallie Jackson, NBC's chief White House correspondent. So without further ado, please help me welcoming them to Politics and Prose.
This is an amazing turnout. Thank you all for coming. I know Steve is appreciative.
Yes, this is incredible. Thank you, guys.
I was saying, aren't you nervous? What if only like 5 people show up? Wouldn't that freak you out?
Yeah, no, that's the great. Or then I take the stage and they realize, oh, that's not the guy we thought.
Wait, that's Steve Kornacki? Wait a sec. We are so thrilled to have you here tonight, and I feel very fortunate to have been asked to come and conduct this. Am I higher than you? Do I look really high?
That's all right. It's,
just beyond I Steve and I got to know Steve during the 2016 campaign when we both covered the run-up to what was an historic election. I now cover the White House, but the roots of that started much before that. So Steve and I would see each other in New York on election nights, on big primary nights. I'm lucky enough to have him come on my show now on MSNBC. I used to go on his show when he had one, and now he's devoted so much of his time to really killing it with the numbers, with the data. He's the guy. I mean, he's the one we all turn to at the network to say, okay, what does this really mean? Explain this. What county should we be looking at on election night? And I think that's an amazing talent, and we're so lucky to have you be able to share that with all of us.
But that's incredibly kind of you. And of course, I called Trump's election in 2016 the whole way, too. So that's,
one of the few to correctly predict, of course. So Steve's new book is called The Red and the Blue. So you guys are just buying it tonight, right? You haven't had a chance to read it yet? Okay. So I was fortunate to get an advance copy to be able to look through this for tonight's event. And I would just say a couple of things about this. So I knew Steve was really great on television, and I knew Steve was one of the smartest encyclopedic minds that I'd ever known. I didn't know he was such a fabulous writer. This book reads like a novel. It's fascinating. It's packed with unbelievable information, but you read it and time flies by. I don't read a lot of politics myself these days because I'm so immersed in it, so I try to read some fiction on the weekends when I can get away from it. But this was something that felt like a real escape. So I think you're all going to be in for a treat. And so let's have a little chat about it.
Let's go.
Cool. We're going to give plenty of time for questions later on. We know there's a lot of you, and so we want to be sure to get to that. But I wanted to start the conversation, Steve, by talking a little bit about what inspired you to write this? Because the origins of this book didn't come from the 2016 campaign. You were thinking about this years and years and years ago. And you talk about there were points when you wanted to give up on writing this. Take us through that.
Yeah, this book, the seed of it, I think, in terms of my decision to do it, goes back to 2009. I would say almost 10 years. And originally, it started out as I think a much narrower project, a much narrower focus. Originally, what I was interested in was sort of the rise of Bill Clinton. And the change, the evolution of the Democratic Party between its sort of low point in the modern era, which I put at sort of the end of the 1984 election. 1984 election, Walter Mondale loses 49 states. He comes a couple thousand votes in Minnesota away from losing all 50 states. Democrats have been wiped out a couple years earlier with Carter. Dukakis got wiped out again 4 years later. It was sort of the very low moment, and there was this sense taking hold. The term back then in politics was that Republicans had a lock on the Electoral College, a lock on the presidency. And from that, there emerged this sort of, Mario Cuomo had been the breakout star of the 1984 Democratic Convention. Bill Clinton was this super ambitious, young Southern governor trying to get attention. And for a couple years there, it was, Clinton doing everything he could to get on people's radar and everything kind of going wrong for him. And then Cuomo not seeming to want it at all, but everybody begging him to run for president. And he passes it up in 88 and then 92. 92 comes along, and Clinton's out there running in late 91, and Cuomo is flirting with it, and it builds to this big moment. I think a big sort of historical moment, and this is in the book. In December 1991, when Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York, it's the filing deadline for the New Hampshire primary. The polls show that if Mario Cuomo gets in the race, he's 30, 40 points ahead of Bill Clinton and everybody else. Overwhelming Democratic favorite. They're begging him to run. George H.W. Bush is starting to look vulnerable. So is Cuomo going to get in the race or not? He charters a plane. It's idling on the tarmac in Albany. The clock is ticking. He's got a guy on the ground in New Hampshire with the declaration of candidacy form. And it's one of these first sort of, there was no MS, there was no Fox, but there was a CNN, and it's one of the first sort of cable news presidential campaign real-time dramas. It plays out on TV. The camera is on the tarmac. It's on the plane. And is Cuomo going to get on that plane and ride into the presidential race, or is something else? And he ultimately decides not to. There's an interesting story behind it in the book that I have, but I just saw it as a very momentous moment. Obviously, I think it's one of the moments that allowed Bill Clinton to become president. I think it raises all sorts of what ifs if Democrats had chosen to go with Cuomo instead of Clinton. And I think then when you look at how Bill Clinton won in 92, got reelected in 96, the evolution of the Democratic Party and American politics that came with that, I thought that was significant. So that was where it started. And as I talked it over with the editor and researched it and developed it and started to put things together, other characters came into the mix. And the biggest one that obviously I knew was there, but that I really started to look a lot more closely at was Newt Gingrich. And the collision of Bill Clinton as president with Newt Gingrich, and the question of how was Newt Gingrich in position to be essentially the leader of Republicans in Congress when Bill Clinton became president, the de facto leader, I would say. He didn't have the title yet. And that's just an incredible story of Newt Gingrich coming from sort of, this, he was a gadfly from West Georgia, running for Congress for his third time in 1978, gets elected, tells Republicans he's going to lead them to the promised land, the majority someday. They think he's a nut. And he ends up just this series of development. Yeah, Dick Cheney called him Dick Cheney was in the House back then, called him a pest, an irritant. And in this series of sort of almost guerrilla political tactics that he employed in the House in the 1980s against the Democratic majority there, he rose and became the de facto leader of the Republican Party. And it's just this collision. It's this collision of Clinton, collision of Gingrich. There's the Republican Revolution in 94. There's the shutdown of 95. There's the Clinton comeback of 96. There's impeachment in 98. The emergence of Hillary Clinton. Also the collapse of health care, Hillary care earlier in the decade. And all of it just builds. What I realized was all of this builds to the 2000 election. And the 2000 election is the closest thing we've ever seen and may ever see in this country to a perfect tie in a presidential election. And it's the 2000 election when people look up, not only is it so close, but these divisions are so stark. Mm-hmm. The entire South is Republican and it's red. It's the first time we've started talking about these colors in this context. The Northeast, minus New Hampshire, barely, it's blue. The Pacific Coast, it's blue. Around Chicago, the counties, suburbs outside Chicago, blue. The interior of the country, red. And those divisions, red and blue, colors that had never meant anything before in politics, that's where the definition and meaning came from. You
talk about seeing on the cable news chyrons in the election of 2000. Before that, you'd have red and blue, and maybe they'd switch, right. And it kind of depended on the mood that the producer was in. Imagine that today. Imagine seeing the name of Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton in red or Donald Trump in blue. It would be like cognitive dissonance. And you write about this, and you talk about how until then, we didn't think about the country in terms of red states and blue states. That was something that developed after this decade of extraordinary political moments, as you described. So keep that in mind as we have this conversation. What Steve did in this book was he used the through lines of Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, and other things as well, but mostly those two to sort of frame this, to talk about how we got to the age today where Donald Trump is president, Hillary Clinton is a private citizen. We're in this moment of deep, deep partisan divides, as has been made explicitly clear with the events of today and the Supreme Court drama that went down on Capitol Hill. It is literally relevant tonight, Friday night, as we sit here in Politics and Prose. You talk about Newt Gingrich, and this was one of the characters that you develop in this piece, in this book. You and I had this discussion, and you said, it's so interesting to look back in hindsight, and there are 4 or 5 really great anecdotes that you look back on, and you go, oh my God, that taught us so much about where we got to today. And one of them was Newt Gingrich and Jim Wright, and his takedown, essentially. And I'm going to flip to this quote, if I can find it in time. But you talk about how... Did my mic just go off?
This one's still.
You talk about how Jim Wright was the best thing that ever happened to Newt Gingrich. Explain that.
Right. So Jim Wright was the House Speaker who followed Tip O'Neill. So we're taking you back to the 1980s here, and I say Newt Gingrich took that journey from gadfly, from irritant. Even Republicans saw him as an irritant. They didn't take him seriously when he came to the House in 1978. When he came to the House, the term was starting to come into fashion: the permanent Democratic Congress, permanent Democratic majority. It had been at that point a generation, 1954, since Republicans had controlled the House, but they weren't even close. We're having an election in a couple of weeks, and Democrats need a net gain of 23 seats, and they can take back the House. Maybe they'll get there, maybe they won't, but it's totally doable for them. We didn't have midterm elections where it was doable for Republicans to get back the House. They were 80, 90, 100 seats buried in the minority back then. That's the House Gingrich walked into. And Gingrich was telling Republicans, he came to a Republican Party that still had liberal Republicans from the Northeast. In the Senate back then, I have this in there, Jacob Javits, senator from New York. He would run for re-election every 6 years in New York. He could do multiple parties in New York. He'd run as the Republican nominee and the Liberal Party nominee in New York. That's the world. That's the Republican Party that existed back then. There were, Bob Taft Republicans from the Midwest, and there were Jacob Javits liberals from the Northeast. And the Democratic Party had conservative Southerners, sharing a party with Charlie Rangel and Barney Frank. So there were these sort of awkward coalitions. And what Gingrich was saying was, it was the idea of nationalizing politics. Republicans were winning presidential elections. Nixon got a 49-state landslide in 72. He was saying, if we can do it nationally, we can do it locally. And he said the key is, Nixon, crushed George McGovern. Well, make every Democrat running for every office at every level George McGovern. Make people see that distinction. Make the Democrats the party of McGovern liberalism, and make our party, Gingrich was saying, the party of conservative opportunity, a conservative opportunity party, conservative opportunity society, he called it, versus a liberal welfare state. That's what he was offering. He wanted Republicans to offer that contrast. And he says part of that, in the House of Representatives, every day, on every issue, in every way, tactically, rhetorically, Republicans need to be driving home that there are just big, giant, deep, fundamental, irreconcilable differences between the political parties. And one of the issues, one of the things he settled on to was this idea of, running against corruption. Was running for reform and against corruption, against, he called it a Democrat machine. And Jim Wright was the House Speaker who succeeded Tip O'Neill in January 1987. And Gingrich, a few months later, it's probably 6 months into Jim Wright's term as Speaker, Gingrich learns there was a Washington Post story that Jim Wright had a book deal, and there's this book, and it was not a book you probably would have found in a store like this.
It was a Steve book. It was
a pamphlet. It was essentially a pamphlet, and he'd gotten some money from, it looked like Jim Wright was a Texas, sort of old school Texas Democrat, and it looked a bit like a shady Texas deal here. His donors had ponied up all this money, his friends had ponied up money, and so Gingrich started highlighting this and said, the Speaker is corrupt, Speaker is dishonest,
and this was Republicans at the time didn't want to engage in this. They sort of said, "Hey, we don't do that in Washington. That's not how we roll." Right.
This was you don't sort of like the general in an army. You don't shoot the general. Maybe the troops can fight, but you don't shoot the general. So here's Gingrich going after the House Speaker. But what happened was a couple things happened. First of all, he started to get some traction with it. He started to get some more media coverage, feedback from Republican grassroots, conservative grassroots. Was egging him on, telling him to go for it. And Republican leaders started noticing it. And at first, they didn't jump on. They didn't join him at first. But it was a big moment there. The difference between Jim Wright and Tip O'Neill. Republicans liked Tip O'Neill. He was this old, Boston Irish Catholic, North Cambridge, Mass. He was a storyteller. He'd put his arm around you, and Jim Wright was standoffish. Jim Wright was a lot more tactical, a lot more strategic. Jim Wright's vision of the House speakership was, I'm going to claw back power from the executive branch, from the Reagan administration. So and Democrats Republicans in the minority for 30 plus years at that point, Newt has been telling them, you guys are getting walked all over by these Democrats. They're arrogant. And Jim Wright really started to make Republicans feel that. So eventually, after a couple months of this, with Newt is going after Jim Wright, Republicans start liking it. Yeah, this guy kind of deserves it. This party kind of deserves it. And it builds and it builds. It takes 18 months. Spring of 1989 finally reaches critical mass. some of the ethics watchdogs groups, Common Cause, they weigh in against Wright, and Wright has to resign. No Speaker of the House in history has ever resigned because of ethics accusations, ethics violations. Jim Wright has to resign, and he goes to the floor of the House. And you can find the speech online. Thank you, C-SPAN Archives. It's amazing to go back and watch. June 1st, 1989. Jim Wright goes to the floor of the House, and he offers his resignation, and he frames his resignation literally as a sacrifice. He says, I am offering my resignation as a sacrifice to cleanse this institution of what has infected it. And he's talking about Gingrich. And he's talking about Gingrich-style politics. And he says at least, that by resigning, it's going to preserve his house, the house he knew. But in reality, that was, by that point, Gingrich, right around that same time, he climbs into Republican leadership. There's a Republican leadership election right as he's taking down Jim Wright. That makes him number 2. He wins it by 2 votes, 89 to 87, puts him in the Republican leadership and puts him in position. As I said, a couple years later, when Republicans get that majority, that nobody saw coming until it happened in 94, but that made him Speaker of the House.
And the tactics that he talked about and that he used and the way that he framed this fight, we see so many echoes of that today. One of the other things that Gingrich understood early that I think you can draw a straight line from Gingrich on to Donald Trump today is Newt Gingrich recognized that in his early years at least, as sort of a backbencher, he's not going to get attention from the dominant media, from ABC, CBS, NBC, big 3 news networks back then, broadcast networks. At that point, cable news was in its infancy. He needed a way to connect with people because he wasn't going to get attention from the traditional press. And what he realized was, in 1979, C-SPAN threw a camera in the House chamber. And they broadcast all the proceedings. And there was this not obscure, but there was this provision of House rules that said any member can claim the floor for any amount of time and any reason they want after the close of business every day. And traditionally people, members of Congress looked at that like, you're talking to an empty chamber. Go ahead, waste your time at 10 o'clock at night. We'll go play poker, we'll go out drinking, whatever. There's a lot of fraternizing between Democrats and Republicans after hours. Gingrich wanted no part of that. He starts claiming the time, and he has about a handful of allies in the early years. They start claiming the time. And if you go back and watch it, they weren't really talking about what was in, the bill that was discussed that afternoon in committee. I mean, sometimes they were, but really they were talking about bigger national themes, national politics, this idea of fundamental distinctions between the two parties, the conservative opportunity society, the liberal welfare state. What they were doing was producing what you would now recognize, I think, as a cable news talk show. A conservative cable news talk show from the floor of the House. And it's being broadcast on C-SPAN, and this is proliferation of cables taking place in the 80s. People are scanning their dial, and they're, what's this ESPN thing? What are those numbers? And then, you get to channel 43 or whatever, and there's this guy on the floor of the House, railing against the corrupt Democrat machine. People started to notice. And Republican congressmen who had been writing off Gingrich start hearing from, they start getting letters, they start getting phone calls. Why isn't their congressman talking like Newt Gingrich is? Why isn't their congressman fighting like Newt Gingrich is? He went around the media and he found a way. And you look at Donald Trump and Twitter. It's a similar, it's a similar idea. Sound familiar, yeah. Let's talk about Democrats here before we get to Donald Trump, which is something else that you write about. Donald Trump in the late 90s, 99, and his flirtation with this Reform Party bid. But before we get there, Bill Clinton. And he touched on this with his sort of what could have been a big marquee battle with Mario Cuomo. Right. At the time, the governor of New York. He was polling well ahead of where Bill Clinton was, ended up deciding not to run. And you said something to me when we were talking this week, and you said, imagine what today would look like if Mario Cuomo had decided to run and beat Bill Clinton, and we never had the Clintons, and that they weren't a part of American life and politics. Such a seminal moment that happened in this time period that you write about.
Yeah, December 20th, 1991 is the date. And I just think it's a major turning point in American political history because Mario Cuomo, as I was sort of, outlining before, he's got the plane chartered. Polls have him running way ahead of Bill. Remember, 1992 was in January, February 91, we had the Gulf War. And the Gulf War went a lot faster than anybody thought it would. There were far fewer. There were predictions of it's Vietnam in the desert. And instead, the ground war lasted less than 100 hours. And almost every big-name Democrat had voted against the Gulf War in 91. And this is the party, so the Democratic Party seems to be discredited on this issue. That's the conventional wisdom. And all the big names in the Democratic Party stay out of the race. And it allows Bill Clinton to step forward. Paul Tsongas, Massachusetts, Tom Harkin, Doug Wilder, Jerry Brown, who had like vanished from American politics for a decade. He was in India and Japan, and suddenly here he is running for president again. So this is Bill Clinton's competition, and the economy is getting worse throughout 91. And Bush, H.W. Bush, goes from 91% in the polls. By the end of the year, he's down to about 50 and going south from there. And Democrats start saying, wait, could be winnable. We got to get a real candidate here. And Mario Cuomo, now it's been 7 years since he gave that speech in San Francisco, but he is still every Democrat's dream candidate. I mean, that speech in San Francisco, you go back and watch that. I mean, there were delegates crying after that. This was a Valentine to New Deal liberalism, to the Great Society, to the promise of that brand of liberalism. And it's this idea for Democrats of, hey, this is what we've been missing. We've been getting our clocks cleaned by Reagan and by the Republicans. It's because we haven't had, Reagan's the great communicator. Cuomo's our great communicator. That was the promise. You don't have to compromise. Reagan's going after, the idea of government. Government is the problem. You don't have to cede that government's the problem if you get behind Mario Cuomo. That was the promise of Cuomo. So it all builds to that moment. He does not get in. One of the things I have in the book is one of the last phone calls he placed that morning. And he's in his office in Albany, still trying to decide. He was racked with indecision about this. He felt immense pressure to run. He did not seem personally to want to run. And he placed a phone call to a former aide whose opinion he respected, probably on a level maybe a little different from other people around him. And it was Tim Russert. And Tim Russert had been a Cuomo aide. And what Cuomo respected about Tim Russert, among other things, was that Russert had gone from his staff to make it in D.C. Tim Russert was at NBC at that point. I think he was the bureau chief. And when he called him, as I understand it, Russert, I think on a more of a human level, understood that Mario Cuomo was looking for permission not to run for president. He felt this immense pressure, and it was almost a how do I get out of this thing? And what Russert, I think, told him was that if you go to New Hampshire and you don't have a budget, because there was a budget standoff in Albany at that point, Bill Clinton's really going to make that an issue with you. And it was, now, would that have cost Mario Cuomo the presidency? That's very, very debatable. Did that give Mario Cuomo a justification to say, yeah, you're right, Albany needs me, I don't have to run for president? So Mario Cuomo, after that, a couple hours later, he makes a statement he's not running for president. Bill Clinton becomes the frontrunner almost overnight. In the absence of any other options, Democrats start coalescing around him. 3 weeks later, the Jennifer Flowers scandal breaks. Jennifer Flowers steps forward and says she had a 12-year affair with Governor Clinton. And remember, the context for understanding a scandal like this at that moment was Gary Hart. It had destroyed Gary Hart, the frontrunner 4 years earlier. Now here's Bill Clinton. Well, obviously this is going to destroy him. And then she has tapes. She has tapes of the phone conversation she says she had with Bill Clinton, like some of them the summer before. On the tapes, this is the part that I think gets forgotten when people look back at the Cuomo Clinton. On the tapes, Bill Clinton's calling Mario Cuomo mafioso. He's likening him to a mob boss. And I'm just, the what if that I was asking myself with this is, if Mario Cuomo got in that plane and gets in the race, there's a school of thought that Bill Clinton is such a peerless politician, such a peerless communicator, that he would have found a way to beat Mario Cuomo. And I take the point, but I think that Bill Clinton, being hit with a scandal that had just taken out Gary Hart, everybody already thinking Mario Cuomo is the more electable candidate, that scandal hits, those tapes hit, Mario Cuomo being called mafioso by Bill Clinton, who's just been accused of an extramarital affair, I think Mario Cuomo would have had the power in that moment to destroy Bill Clinton. He never can prove it. Bill Clinton's been proven indestructible in a lot of ways. So I take, I stipulate this, but I do think it raises a big what if. I think Mario Cuomo could have beaten Bill Clinton for the Democratic nomination. I think Mario Cuomo could have, just given where the economy was, where when you start looking at the rest of the 92 campaign, could have beaten George H.W. Bush. And if Mario Cuomo becomes president, now I don't know, is there baggage from Albany? But the sexual politics of the 90s that came with electing Bill Clinton president. The impeachment is obviously the peak of it, but there was a lot more than that. And it continued to resonate in our politics for a generation. When Donald Trump got in trouble in the 2016 campaign, with the Access Hollywood tape, had a debate with Hillary Clinton, 2 days later? What did Donald Trump do to equalize the playing field politically? He brought Bill Clinton's accusers out. What if there's a Mario Cuomo in the 90s?
quite the thought experiment. You talk about that moment, which triggered so much over the next decade. And one of those things that it triggered as we talk about Donald Trump was his continued flirtation, and he already had been by the late 90s, with getting into the political sphere. Before Donald Trump ran for president and came down that golden escalator in 2015 at Trump Tower, he talked a ton about running for president. He never actually did it. He wasn't taken super seriously by the media, but he understood, even back in the late 90s, how to work the media. And Pat Buchanan has kind of an interesting role to play in this.
Pitchfork Pat. Yeah.
Right. So talk through that. Explain a little bit about the two of them and how that all turned out.
Yeah, I mean, Pat Buchanan pops up in this book a lot because, again, talk about through lines here and connections to the present. You know, Pat Buchanan, in terms of positions on issues, was Donald Trump before there was a Donald Trump. At least Donald Trump as we currently understand him. Pat Buchanan, first of all, sort of like Trump, benefited from the evolution and the explosion of mass media and its fusion with politics. Buchanan benefited from that because he was the original pundit turned candidate. Buchanan went from being a speechwriter for Richard Nixon, started hosting a radio show here in D.C. in the 1970s. It became, eventually Crossfire. CNN's launched in 1980. They're going to 30 minutes a night on CNN. We're going to do politics, and it's going to be a debate show, and it's going to be Pat Buchanan on the right and Tom Braden on the left, and they're going to duke it out for 30 minutes every night. And then the other one that explodes around the same time on PBS and syndicated television is the McLaughlin Group, and Pat Buchanan's on the McLaughlin Group, and John McLaughlin was, this is a small story, but I love this one. Buchanan and McLaughlin knew each other from the Nixon White House. McLaughlin had been a Jesuit priest, a politically active Jesuit priest, who ran for the Senate in Rhode Island back, I think, 1972, one of those two, against the Vietnam War. And then Buchanan started talking to him and got him to change his position on the Vietnam War as it was going in the wrong direction and brought him into the Nixon White House. And that was John McLaughlin. So they had a partnership there. McLaughlin then, he charms a lot of people in Washington. He ends up hosting this show, the McLaughlin Group, and Buchanan's on it. And that explodes in popularity. And Buchanan parlays all of that in 1992. George H.W. Bush, has run for president in 88 saying, read my lips, no new taxes. Then he raised taxes. So Buchanan runs against him as a conservative challenger in the primaries, does better than expected, but it's taken as a protest vote, and not much is read into it. In 96, Buchanan runs again with a cable news stint in between. And Buchanan runs in 96, and at first everybody says, well, protest candidate, nobody, it's Phil Graham's the conservative alternative to Bob Dole. Bob Dole's the big Republican frontrunner. Buchanan starts gaining traction, and he does it with a message. There are a couple tenets to this message. Number one is Pat Buchanan wants a moratorium, a 5-year moratorium on all immigration. Because especially since Hart-Celler in the 1960s, there's been this explosion, and we are, aspects of Western culture, American are threatened here. Another thing he wants is a wall, not a wall, but a fence along the entire southern border. Build that fence. He rails against the recently passed in November 1993 North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Pat Buchanan is at that point, the most prominent Republican who is actually against NAFTA. He says these trade deals are destroying the American worker. And he promises to revive American manufacturing and tear up unfair trade deals. He runs on that. He rails, political correctness. The term political correctness had really kind of come to prominence in the early 90s. Pat Buchanan rails against political correctness. He rails against multiculturalism. Hopefully some of this is sounding familiar. And as, this platform, economic nationalism, American heritage, these sorts of things, it attracts some fringe supporters, some interest from the right-wing fringes, most notably David Duke. And David Duke is out there in 1996, in the Louisiana caucuses in 1996. Louisiana moves up its date. Everybody's always trying to jump New Hampshire and become the first one. So Louisiana moves theirs up. All of the candidates boycott it because they don't want to offend New Hampshire. But Phil Graham doesn't. And Pat Buchanan says, I'm going to go fight Phil Graham in the bayou. And so it's Phil Graham versus Pat Buchanan, and it's essentially an elimination contest. If Graham can destroy Buchanan, Buchanan can be finished off here. David Duke, of course, had run for governor of Louisiana a few years ago, and David Duke still has a political network in Louisiana. He steps forward and says, I'm going to vote for Pat Buchanan in this primary. And Pat Buchanan is accused by all of his Republican opponents of failing to disassociate himself from David Duke. It becomes a major issue. Buchanan wins what he calls the Battle of the Bayou. He crushes Phil Gramm. That's it for Phil Gramm. Gets a close second place, 3 points. Loses by 3 points in Iowa to Bob Dole. And Bob Dole had been called the president of Iowa before that. And then 8 days later, they go to New Hampshire, and Pat Buchanan wins the New Hampshire primary. And it is this moment of panic that 20 years later, it's what Republicans were saying about Trump as he sort of blazed through the Republican primaries. That moment, and Buchanan even says this in his victory speech that night, he is triumphant. This is the one where he says, I've got orders for the troops in the field, mount up and ride to the sound of the guns. He says the fax machines are going to be buzzing in Washington, coming out with the talking points. He's a very colorful guy. And it was that moment of, Republicans realizing, first of all, that ideology that Buchanan's running on has a greater hold on their voters than they ever thought, than they ever realized. And then there's that fear of, if we nominate him, are we going to lose? Are we going to not just lose the election, but are we going to get destroyed as a party? And there was that fear. Now, they were able in 96. They rallied around Bob Dole. Dole won big in South Carolina. That ended it. Buchanan didn't get the nomination. But a couple years later, 2000 is looming. Buchanan wants to run again. 1999. And George W. Bush is emerging as the establishment pick on the Republican side. And Buchanan, see if this sounds familiar, Buchanan declares the Republican primary process rigged and says, I'm going to leave the Republican Party and I'm going to run for the nomination of the Reform Party. That was Ross Perot, from his two, failed independent bids. This is the skeletal remnants of it. Buchanan's going to go run in a third party. And somebody steps forward to run against Pat Buchanan for the nomination of the Reform Party in the fall of 1999. Somebody who maybe watched Perot sort of, get politically famous through television, Donald Trump. Donald Trump steps forward to run against Pat Buchanan. And everything I'm telling you about what Pat Buchanan had said and advocated in the 1990s, Donald Trump's response to it was to call Pat Buchanan a racist, a bigot, an anti-Semite, a Hitler lover. He said he was appalled that Pat Buchanan would let his name be mentioned in the same company as David Duke. That was Donald Trump. In 1990, Donald Trump took a trip to something called the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles. And Donald Trump took a visit to this, brought all the cameras, took a tour of the museum, came out, and basically said, I wish Pat Buchanan would come here. He could learn something from this. That was the Trump for President campaign in 99 and 2000. Now, he never formally entered. He was exploring it, but he was Trump. In terms of personality, he'd quote a poll and tell, I'm doing great in the polls. What poll? The Inquirer. You had those, and he was calling people names, and but it all ends. Now, the Reform nomination is going to be settled at a convention. You've got to build like a real grassroots network to win the convention. Buchanan was crushing Trump when it came to actually building an organization to win the nomination. It's clear Trump was not going to win the Reform Party nomination. In February 2000, this is an amazing document to go back and look at now. Donald Trump decides he's going to pull the plug on this thing. And he does so with an op-ed in the New York Times. This is February of 2000. And if you go and read the op-ed today, it is Donald Trump saying that he looked at Pat Buchanan and he looked at the Reform Party and he looked at the elements that Pat Buchanan's Reform Party was attracting, especially David Duke, because David Duke had endorsed Buchanan again. And he couldn't in good conscience be part of a political movement that would have these people be part of it. Donald Trump in 2000, as he gets out of that race. And he says at the very end of the op-ed, though, but I love the experience. Maybe I'll do it again.
You're telling a good story when the audience is literally gasping as you're telling it. It is a remarkable book. That's one of the most interesting stories in it, given the moment that we're in now. You close the book by talking about, and as we think about, Donald Trump obviously got a taste for the presidential run. He had announced that exploratory bid. He never actually ran, but he announced it. Went on NBC, went on CNN, went on ABC, talked about maybe getting Oprah as his running mate. That's where that soundbite came from, was from back in the late 90s. But you close the book by talking about a joke that Letterman made after the 2000 election had gone down. And he says, the candidates have worked out a compromise, Letterman joked. And he says, thank God, not a minute too soon. George W. Bush will be president of the red states. Al Gore will be president for the blue states. And you write, the audience laughed at a joke that never before in American history would have made any sense. And that was only 18 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. It was less than a generation ago, right? So before we get to audience questions, then talk a little bit about the tough one, where this goes, because we are in a moment of tribalism, and we are in a moment where people feel incredibly divided, and people feel like they can't talk to their family, and people feel like we are red and blue, and there is no purple left. What happens from here?
Yeah.
In 30 seconds or less.
Yeah. Pray. No, it's the thing I think that happened in the 90s, just to in terms of a reference point going forward, is red and blue. We've had moments of deep national. We've had a civil war in this country, but all of the divisions, all of the dividing lines, didn't line up with party like they do now. And that's a product of the 90s, I think. That's what the red-blue map of 2000, that's what the title of the book gets to. It gets this idea, this poll in 2016, it asked Democrats and Republicans, basically if they would be bothered if their son or daughter married somebody from the other party. And numbers more than 60% in each party that say that. And that, to me, is how this, to be part of red America or blue America, it's much more than an expression now of, I agree that the capital gains tax should be, X percent. It's now an expression of cultural identity, of personal identity, of social identity. And I think that's a new thing. The old thing is tribalism, in that we're hardwired, I think, to a degree as human beings to be tribal, but to have it sync up with political party, I think that's the change from the 90s. I think in terms of where it goes from here, the hope I take is this. I don't have a particular prescription. I could make a fortune, I think, going around with my 5-point plan to end tribal. I wish I had. Maybe I can fake one and make some money too. But it's essentially this. This is going to probably sound vague and pretty weak. But I think human nature in some ways, in a lot of ways, got us into this. I think the media landscape, the political landscape, the way politicians use the media, I think all of that evolved in the last generation or two in a way that is incredibly conducive to tribalism, to something that in some ways is innate in us. Our political media system evolved in a way that brings that out in us. So if human nature kind of created this mess, will we reach a point, and I think we all, whatever side you're on in all this, maybe we all, get sick of this. Does it reach a point where we do get just tired of it, tired of the constant in-your-face division, and human nature finds a way out of it? That's my hopeful note. Thank you.
I think it's good to end on something optimistic.
Yes, that's it.
We want to open up the floor to questions. As Michael said before, there are some microphones if you guys want to line up, and Steve's happy to field whatever comes his way.
Let's do it.
Sure. Hi. I worked on Gary Hart's 1984 campaign and Bruce Babbitt's 1988 campaign because I believe in 270 electoral votes. Do you honestly think, though, that after McGovern in 72 and Mondale in 84, that Mario Cuomo in New York, Northern liberal, truly could have cobbled together 270 electoral votes to win that election, especially because arguably Clinton only did it because Perot sapped away 20%.
Read the book on that one. Perot didn't No, thank you. And I hear it all. So who knows, right? I take the point that we don't know if Cuomo could have won in the fall, and I don't know either. He might have been a disaster as a candidate. I do think that what you saw in '92 was George H.W. Bush's approval rating was in the 30s. The unemployment rate was climbing all year. This was a traumatic moment, I think, for the country, economically traumatic moment. In the middle of the summer of '92, it hit over 8%, which was a big climb from where it had been. So there was this broad sense. There had been a number of scandals in Washington, too. There, the Keating Five, you had the House banking scandal. There was this strong sense that Washington was broken. There was this strong sense that George H.W. Bush he'd prosecuted a war brilliantly, but he couldn't manage an economy. That was a pervasive sense. He had deep problems on the Republican side because of Pat Buchanan, because of the fracturing of the Republican Party. So I do think, I don't know if the map looks quite the same. I'm not saying Mario Cuomo wins Arkansas or something, but could Cuomo have won Ohio in '92? Could he have won Michigan, Pennsylvania? I love that we can sit here 20. I could do an hour dissecting alternative scenarios for the '92 election. I won't subject you to that. But on the Perot front, I would say this. And I think George H.W. Bush himself said this a couple years ago. I think he still thinks that Ross Perot cost him the election in '92. Again, Ross Perot to me was a symptom of George H.W. Bush's problems. He was not the cause of George H.W. Bush's problems. Ross Perot emerged when George H.W. Bush was already starting to fall behind in head-to-head polls. Ross Perot emerged when George H.W. Bush's approval rating, as I say, was starting to fall from the 40s into the 30s. We also got again, polls are polls, but Perot dropped out of the race for a 10-week stretch in the summer and fall of 1992, from the middle of July to the end of September. Not a single poll in the Perot-less phase of that race had George, even after the Republican convention, had George H.W. Bush ahead in that race. In fact, his average margin was double digits of being behind Bill Clinton. So, yes, anything could have happened. I don't know. And if you took an exit poll on Election Day and you asked Perot voters who was your second choice, they were split. They were split between Clinton and Bush, and a bunch of them said they would have stayed home. I think the Perot coalition was that 20% he got in 92 was a little more funky ideologically. People remember the disgruntled Buchanan voters from the Republican primary, and that became a bit of the Perot base going forward. But to get 20%, don't forget, there were disgruntled Tsongas voters. People who, Bill Clinton had taken him out and used some pretty strong attacks to do it. There were disgruntled Jerry Brown voters. There were a lot of disgruntled people sort of across the spectrum.
Hi. So every time I hear something about how Newt Gingrich sort of changed everything, especially as someone who was born in 1996, and therefore everything about Newt Gingrich, like, either happened before I was born or before I had literally any kind of cognitive memory. So all the things that you use to describe Newt Gingrich as someone who helped ramp up the tribalism of the parties and change the Republican Party through Congress, when I think about that, I think about a man named Mitch McConnell. And my question is, how does Mitch McConnell fit into this story with Gingrich and Trump and everyone else?
Well, I think what Gingrich did is he convinced Republicans to change sort of the norms of conduct, of legislative conduct in Congress. And he was telling them basically that the old way of, okay, you're the ranking member on the committee, you settle for, 35% or whatever with the committee chair who's going to be a Democrat, you compromise, the Democrats want 10% hike in taxes, you settle for 5 and call it you cut a deal. Gingrich was saying, we're getting nowhere doing that. And he was also telling Republicans that it wasn't just that they were getting nowhere sort of philosophically, issue-wise, they were also getting trampled. One of the moments in the book, 'cause I write about the rise of Gingrich, one of the animating moments for Gingrich's rise within Republicans on Capitol Hill was in 84-85. There was a contested House election in Indiana, a district called the Bloody Eighth, the 8th District of Indiana. No incumbent had won re-election there in 20 years. And the rules said, the House is the judge of its own elections. So a disputed election in this district, the Democratic Congress chose to seat the Democrat. And they sent a panel out there. It was 2 Democrats, 1 Republican. The 2 Democrats voted. The Republicans watched this happen, the Republicans in the House, and they said, you know what, Gingrich is right. We are getting trampled on here. Playing nice with these guys isn't getting us anywhere. And I think a major moment, transformative moment in politics on Capitol Hill was May 85, when the vote was held in the House to seat the Democrat from Indiana's Bloody 8th District. Tip O'Neill, the House Speaker, is presiding over the chamber. All the Republicans vote no. They're like 80 votes short. They're going to lose on this. They're going to seat the member now. Bob Michael is technically the Republican. He's the Republican leader, the Republican minority leader. His nickname is Mr. Nice Guy. He's golfing buddies with Tip O'Neill. He plays poker with Tip O'Neill. He goes to a testimonial dinner for Tip O'Neill, and he says, I love this man. Newt has been telling Republicans, this is getting you nowhere, this Mr. Nice Guy routine. Newt gets up. He's going to lead the Republicans out of the chamber in protest. Bob Michael gets up, and he's walking up the aisle with the rest of the Republicans, and Tip O'Neill, his golfing buddy, calls out to him, and he says, will the gentleman please remain to welcome the new member? And Mr. Nice Guy turns around and says, no. And he walks out. And it was, I say, Newt Gingrich tactically made a decision that definition and contrast and partisan warfare, that was going to be a tool. But I also say that 40 years of Democratic rule did create an appetite among Republicans who maybe weren't even with Gingrich ideologically to embrace the same tools, in their view, to break out of jail. When he made it into leadership, the key votes weren't just from one of the key votes. I say he won by 2 votes to get into the leadership in 1989. Key vote, Olympia Snowe from Maine. Olympia Snowe from Maine. Nancy Johnson moderate Republican from West Hartford, Connecticut. Okay, those were the key votes, and what they were voting on was these Democrats are abusing their power and they're abusing us, and we've been taking it for too long. And you just I just think you're talking about tactics McConnell uses now. I mean, we've seen the filibuster go. The filibuster was done away with by Democrats actually a couple of years ago, but on Supreme Court nominations it was done away by McConnell. Yes, but we've seen. I just think the syncing up of this divide with the parties left no incentive for the parties to cling to these old sort of norms and traditions and customs that had kept the House and the Senate moving, and just everything that happens from then is a new and unprecedented step towards dysfunction.
So just to clarify, what you're saying is that because of all the work that Newt Gingrich had done, what happened in the Senate that I credit to Mitch McConnell was basically inevitable.
Yeah, and you can make an argument. I think this book is about how this is the moment it happened. You can make an argument that if Gingrich loses that third congressional election in '78 and becomes a perennial candidate who nobody ever hears about nationally, you can make an argument somebody else was going to come along and do it at some point in a different way, and maybe it would have looked different. I do think there's an inevitability to it, but this is how it happened, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening. I'm a Nigerian Harvard-trained international lawyer based in Nigeria and an opinion writer. It is estimated that Africa is home to 3,000 tribes. Africa has all too often witnessed the dastardly end results of tribalism run amok. To an appreciable extent, the progress made thus far can be attributed to the unrelenting and unwavering urging and strong support of previous U.S. administrations as leading lights and stakeholders in and exemplars of global democracy. So the issue I would like you to address is Trump's quick march against the ramparts of democracy as he uncoils his demagoguery, chicanery, and guiding philosophy of stagecrafted victimization, cynical blame casting, and diabolical division at home and abroad.
So you don't like Trump? Sorry.
That's putting it mildly.
I'm not quite sure what yeah.
Well,
Sorry, I just.
to address his leadership style and trajectory.
Oh, okay, sure. No,
guiding philosophy, which is apparent to the whole world.
I think when I say the world that was created at the end of the 90s and the world that became evident politically to people through the 2000 election, that we're still living with it. I think those divisions, the style of politics that Donald Trump practices, which is a very aggressive, in-your-face, provocative, inflammatory rhetoric that in every way is telling people to take sides. In every way is telling supporters that the implicit message to supporters a lot, I think, with Donald Trump is, you may not like me, but I'm fighting your enemies. And it is suited for what I think was created through the 90s. All of these divisions syncing up into two parties. And it is amazing to me when you look at how Trump got elected in 2016. You look at the number of Republicans or just Trump voters in general who, didn't think he was necessarily competent, qualified to be president. And in the past, you considered those threshold issues. But I think one of the things that allowed Trump to overcome a lot of those reservations was this sense of he's got all the right enemies. And by God, he fights them. And it's almost, to supporters, it's been expressed this way to me, in fact, by some of his supporters. It's like, we feel bullied. We feel bullied by culture that's gotten too liberal. We feel bullied by and we found our own bully to fight back. I think that might be part of the appeal.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Steve, Hallie. My name is PJ. I'm a freshman at American University, and I just registered to vote. I was just wondering, as someone who is thank you. As someone who's in the younger generation here, who's on Twitter, who's on who's on like Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat and stuff like that, especially Twitter, like all day I was following Twitter and stuff like that. My question is, how much has social media influence with politicians changed since the 1990s?
That's a good one, huh? I think. Well, when I say that, I feel like media has evolved in a way that's really conducive to tribalism. Exhibit A: social media, Twitter especially. I mean, Twitter's the one I'm not on the Facebook as much. I downloaded Snapchat once, and they told me it had too much memory, so I had to get rid of it. I don't have that one. But Twitter, right? That's
Twitter is kind of can be a dumpster fire. It can also be really useful. It sort of depends on how you use it and what you use it for. But in the 90s, I mean, one thing that stands out to me when you talk about new media, the technology didn't exist in the 90s, right? But you had blogs coming out, including the Drudge Report, which was critical with the Clinton sex scandal.
Yeah, it's I mean, the evolution of the internet from it was a historic moment, if you want to call it that. This probably doesn't quite rise to the level, but Bob Dole in the October 1996 debate against Bill Clinton, his first one in Hartford, Connecticut, gave out his web address for his campaign. First time in a presidential debate had done that. I think he said WW, and he left off one of the W's, giving out the address. But yeah, it was that, the internet, as we know, it didn't really even exist much in the early 1990s. By the end of the 1990s, it was Matt Drudge with the Drudge Report that, when Newsweek was hesitating on whether to run the Lewinsky story in January 98, you got it up on the Drudge Report. Then when the Ken Starr Report came out, you could read everything online. It was posted online, and people are just going on there and they're reading all of these. And of course, the Starr Report was filled with all sorts of details.
Stuff like that. Was that when he came out?
Andrew Breitbart, as I understand it, was a couple years later, but yeah, through the Drudge Report, But the Drudge Report was the one that it blew up a lot of the sort of media customs.
And then, as a diehard Boston sports fan, I'm from suburban Philadelphia. What advice do you have for a Boston sports fan in Philadelphia?
Move. Oh, wait. And look at it. She's an Eagles fan, by the way.
So Eagles fly is the only way.
By the way, Hallie, yes, I'm a diehard, Patriots fan. And after I watched the Patriots somehow lose that Super Bowl this year, I got an email the next day from my boss at work telling me we're going to need you on Thursday this week to sit in for the 10 a.m. show because the host, Hallie Jackson, has to go to the Eagles victory parade. Thank you again.
We're very appreciative. Thank you.
Hope you had a good time that day.
Hi, it's good to see you both. Also, my mom says hi. I just had to say it.
Well, tell her I say hi back.
I wanted to ask you a broader question about data, specifically about data journalism. When I doubt words, I always go back to the numbers. But nowadays, when I'm reading a breadth of amount of information, the numbers vary. The numbers vary on who I speak to, whether it's right, left, middle. I guess, in your words, how do you defend your data?
Well, I mean, look, it's a couple of things. Like 2016, I think the easy thing that gets said a lot is just, the data was wrong and Trump got elected. And I do think that the national polls in 2016 were correct. Our final NBC poll in 2016's national horse race poll had Hillary Clinton winning by 4 points. Now, she didn't win by 4 points, but she won the popular vote by nearly 3 points. So there was, that's pretty close in terms of a national horse race poll. Where the polls missed in 2016, it was in really those three states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And more broadly, though, it was what they missed, I think, was a swath of the country that you could draw a line kind of from North Dakota down through Missouri, head east, go up through Appalachia, Pennsylvania, cut into like western New York, North Country New York, northern Vermont, northern New Hampshire, western Maine. In that region, and we talk about blue-collar, non-college white voters, that is a region where you saw the most significant surges of turnout among that demographic, but also the flips. These are where you see these counties that went from, Barack Obama by 10 points to Donald Trump by 20 points. That's where you saw it. And it wasn't just missing in those three states. I think it was missing that type of voter in that part of the country. And I've I talked to different pollsters with different theories. One thing that was put out to me, I know after the election, that always kind of resonated was the idea that that distinction between college, non-college white voters, each one's like a third of the country, give or take. That in the past, that distinction hasn't mattered as much. If you're getting the right number of white voters, more or less in your poll, you're getting a good. You needed to really account for maybe that divide. And if you didn't, your poll numbers might be off. And if there was such a surge and such a change among non-college white voters, you might miss it. And if you're going to miss it, that's where you're going to miss it. And that seems to be what happened.
Thank you.
I think we probably have time for 2 or 3 more.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, okay.
Hi, so I'm wondering if you can maybe help me make sense of what happened today and make me feel a little bit better about it as we find ourselves on the solemn march towards Brett Kavanaugh being seated on the Supreme Court. I'm wondering what you believe the electoral impact of this nomination is going to be, and if it's going to impact the Senate races more than the House races. Just help me feel better about what
You covered it all day. What's your readout?
I'd be curious as your take as to how it's going to affect the midterm. So, a hugely significant day, a huge victory for Donald Trump, and a huge victory for the White House. This is what he promised he would do for 2 years leading up to the November of 2016, and he has done it. Is the big picture look. Now, the question is, Democratic and Republican enthusiasm. And I know you're looking at these numbers. I actually booked Steve on my show to talk about this, and then we got blown out from all the hearing coverage. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. Democratic enthusiasm is incredibly high, in large part because of this. You see this. The protests have been unbelievable on Capitol Hill in the sense of well-organized, loud, constant, right up there with senators. It actually affected Jeff Flake's vote last week on the Judiciary Committee hearing, right? So Democrats, progressives are extremely enthusiastic, and there's no reason not to believe that wouldn't carry into the midterms. Here's the thing that has changed in the last week and a half. Republican enthusiasm has also spiked. Is it a sugar high? Brett Kavanaugh is going to be on the court. He'll probably end up sworn in, I would guess, by Tuesday or Wednesday at the latest, right? That's still 3.5 weeks out from the midterm. Somebody pointed this out today. Remember when the Access Hollywood tape dropped before the presidential election? October 7th, right? Brett Kavanaugh might make it onto the court by October 8th, 9th, in that range. There's a lot that can happen in those last 3 weeks before the midterm. So will Republican enthusiasm remain high, or once they get their guy, do they settle back in? So that's the thing that I'm watching. The president is going out to a rally tomorrow night. He's going to be very fired up about this and talking about this constantly. He's going to be on the road a ton between now and Election Day. So that might help. But I'd be curious as to how you see the numbers shaking out.
No, and that's exactly what I'm looking at. Because to me, the variable of Democratic enthusiasm, I'm kind of taking it as a given that Democrats are going to have just through the roof. There's some question, I think, about Latino support and energy. And I think that's a variable I'm interested in. But looking at we've been talking about these, sort of metropolitan areas around big cities where you've seen this just clear, obvious Democratic intensity. I take it as a given that that's going to be there. The variable, though, to me has been Republican enthusiasm, and exactly what Hallie's saying. I mean, the polls, we've seen a couple of them now. There was another one I just saw that came out tonight, but there was one from Marist the other day that had a 10-point gap over the summer, enthusiasm gap, being cut to 2 points. And when you do that, and Trump's approval rating, by the way, it's been in a very narrow area, but from a couple of weeks ago, remember we were talking about how it was starting to drop back maybe into the 30s. It's up a couple points in the last couple of weeks too. It's getting to the place where Republicans think it gives them a shot. Gives them a shot to increase their seats in the Senate, obviously, but also gives them a shot to hold on to the House. So, but that's the question. I mean, again, 3 weeks ago, if you can go back, I mean, that feels as distant as the stuff I'm writing about in this book, but remember 3 weeks ago, it was Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen and the John McCain funeral and Donald Trump's conduct around that. And it was like, it just felt like, wow, is this a tipping point moment for the Trump presidency? And 3 weeks later, we're talking about, is this a tipping point moment for Republicans to get the enthusiasm back? So, yeah, I have the same question. It's that Republicans have been trying so hard to generate enthusiasm on their side, and they haven't found anything. I don't think they expected it in the least with Kavanaugh, but now they've got it. I don't know if they can keep it, though.
Thank you.
Hi. First of all, I love what you do with the data, so
Thank
doing
you.
that. But on a thing that basically has always had my attention from back 92, I saw Frank Luntz speak at GW and got kind of fascinated with him and his rise with the Republicans and the contract with America and all with Newt Gingrich. And I felt like that trend continued where you could almost know what the word of the day or the buzzword that was going to be used on every news channel over the weekend because they had polled for it. And now this is what we're all going to go out and say lockstep. With this administration, that has completely blown apart. So that used to kind of give me my bellwether of what's happening and where to look. How in the world are you even knowing where to look to focus your data? Because there's no longer a typical. This has been the least typical 3 weeks that no one could have written this.
At least typical, except the 3 weeks before it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
that's
the next ones, yes.
And you're living this every day in the White House. Yeah, I think it just makes just terms of looking at all of this stuff. There were signs in 20. I was not out there saying Donald Trump is going to win, obviously, but there were signs in 2016 that well before November, that our understanding of what we thought the rules of politics were, meaning if a candidate can do this or say this or fails to do this or whatever, there's going to be a price to be paid or there's going to be a reward that comes with that. There were all sorts of indications that those rules maybe didn't work anymore, maybe had never worked, maybe had changed. And it made me, his rise in the 2015 primaries was a very good example because the two comparisons that were drawn early on in Donald Trump's campaign, if you think back to the summer of 2015, one was there was this conventional wisdom that said he's Rudy Giuliani from 2007 and 2008. Remember, Rudy Giuliani ran for president. He was America's mayor from 9/11. Every poll in 2007 had him, at 40% nationally, and then it just kind of fell apart. And I never bought into that one because Trump, the first poll we had, our first NBC poll, when Trump got in the race, put him at 1%. Rudy was never at 1%. Rudy started at 40 and went south from there. Trump started at 1 and, 5 weeks later was in first place. So that one didn't work. Then the other model that people suggested for Trump, and this one I was, at the beginning I was believing, it was the, you could say it was the Herman Cain model. You could say, however, a number of candidates this could have applied to in the past 2 election cycles who get hot for a few weeks. Yeah. They ride a media-generated wave, but then they step in it. Right. Then there's scrutiny. Then the spotlight turns on them, and they fall back. And the moment when I threw it out the window with Trump is when, in September or May or August 2015, when he said John McCain, I don't want heroes aren't people who are captured, whatever the exact wording was there. That's the moment in the past when that candidacy fails. And instead it kept moving like that. And from that point on, I had it in my head through the election. I'm not sure that my understanding of the framework for this thing works. And so then it became about, to me, the challenge from that point forward, and definitely from Election Day 2016 forward, the challenge has been to try to understand if there are still rules in American politics, and if so, what those rules are. And that's what I've been trying to work out. And the other variable in all this is the one sort of theory of politics I've always had just in terms of approaching it is that, and writing this book really reinforced it because it's the story of the 90s in so many ways to me. Every major thing that happens, every time a piece on the board is moved, there's a reaction to it. Mm-hmm. And so you try to figure out what the thing is that's going to happen, but then you try. And what reaction is that going to? So like Donald Trump got elected in 2016, we are living through, in a lot of ways, the reaction to Donald Trump being elected. And we've seen it. We've seen a Democratic Party wave of energy, wave of enthusiasm. Women in particular have stepped forward. There's been this desire, not just among female voters, male voters in Democratic Party, there's a desire to nominate female candidates this year, record numbers. Okay, that's a big part of the reaction to Trump. Let's say, who knows, let's say Democrats take back the House this November. Let's say there is something like a blue wave. I don't know if there's going to be, but let's say there is. And you've got Democrats running the House, and you've got a Democratic Party that's been sort of transformed by the last 2 years, transformed in its ambitions, transformed in the sort of rhetoric it's willing to use against the president, and transformed in what the face of the party is. What's the reaction to that? What reaction does that trigger in the electorate? That's the very, and that's the thing we saw in the 90s is just, the Republican Revolution in 94. Oh my God, the Democratic Party's dead. Newt Gingrich is going to be speaker for, 2 years later, Bill Clinton's reelected easily, So you see these massive shifts, and it's been this, no party that, in this era has taken power, presidency, House, Senate, and taken big, ambitious steps and then been rewarded for it. There's always a reaction, always a backlash.
So I guess I'm the last question. But hi, I'm Gabby. I'm a senior at American University. I have a question, I guess, for both of you. In, I guess, like what seems like an ever-increasing tribal-like political climate, how has that affected the way you approach covering politics when you write a story?
You got an answer on that one?
Well,
Here's how I approach the story. When I want to think about it, ask the question to somebody else.
it's not a bad role for a journalist, to be honest. I mean, here's the thing. So what I do is a lot different from what Steve does, which is why I think I appreciate what Steve does so much. I'm sort of in it, for lack of a better word, right? I'm at the White House every day. I'm in the briefings. I'm in the press conferences. I'm traveling with the president. And you're sort of dug in the nitty gritty. So I see my role as bringing information to people in the sense of, okay, here's what sources are saying on the Democratic side, Republican side. Here's what the White House is saying. Here's what an ally of the White House is saying that they're concerned about, et cetera. And so for me, the way that I see the tribalism that Steve talks about, the political tribalism reflected, is largely in the reaction to whatever I'm reporting out. And so, you know, it's a good question, but for me, the job is the job, right? Like, get in there, figure out what's going on, hold, not to sound naive, but hold truth to power, right? Like, ask the tough questions and just don't back down is sort of the role. And I think for any journalist, you saw that during the Brokaw years, right? You saw that for a generation of journalists that came before me that covered this White House. It is a different moment, I will say, as somebody who goes out into the field or who talks to people a lot. The reactions are very different to members of the media now than they ever used to be. And I don't think, you know, it's not just progressives who come up and say, thank you for the work that you do. There are a lot of people at Trump rallies who will say that as well, believe it or not. There's also some who will yell at you, but that's just sort of what the moment in time that we're in right now.
Yeah, and I mean, just, I guess what I could say is this, just from my standpoint, what I do, I hope that what I do, especially when it was the board and the counties and the numbers and all of that, what I found, at least, is it allows me to have conversations that span that divide. It's one of the few things, everybody, you know, in my life, being in political journalism, I'm used to going to social events and family events and parties, and you know, somebody asks, you know, what do you do? And I'm in, you know, political journalism, you know, thank you. And they turn and they want to talk to, you know, who cares? In the last 2 years,
Never had that experience.
The last 2 years, it's like, oh my God, and everybody wants to talk to you about politics. And if I'm with a group of people like that, who are on the red side of it, I'm with a group on the blue side, what I can do, I feel, is the thing they have in common, at least as it relates to me, is they all want to know who's going to win. They all want to know who is winning, who's losing, what it looks like in this race, what it looks like in that race. There is a thirst there, obviously, for that bottom line question, but I think also to sort of understand or to try to understand the system and the process that they're all engaged in and they're all fighting in. And I like to think that what I do, I could do it in any political media venue, and I could, you know, have the same credibility, the same, that sort of thing. So I take a little bit of hope from that, I guess, in that I've just had so many conversations that are that suggest there is some common ground there. It's over analysis and numbers and less about some of the bigger questions, but from my standpoint, at least, it gives me a little bit of hope, I guess.
So to wrap up, and on that note, I have a question for you that I think would be illuminative of everything we just discussed, which is when people come up and want to talk to you about politics, do you ever get sick of it? Because I don't think you do.
No, especially, and like I say, when it's elections or whatever, you bring it on. The more, the merrier. It's fun at a party to have people want to talk to you for a change. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Hallie.